The interesting part about this, I think, is that it says more about what happened when we were kids being fed by our mothers and maybe our fathers than it does about anything about where we come from. A taste is acquired, right? And so the way we figure out what our interests are and what we like to do comes largely as a result of what we've experienced before. And in terms of this whole dichotomy of ketchup versus salsa, you probably already know where I'm going with this. Which do you think is the top condiment in the United States?
Salsa.
Actually, you're all wrong, it's mayonnaise. So, and I still don't understand that one. Yes, the number 2 is salsa. Can anybody guess about how much in revenue? Well, anyway, it's about $780 million in change in revenue, versus ketchup, which is in the 450s, I think. And of course, Heinz has the lion's share of the market, so please keep going back to the Heinz family for support. But the reason why I mentioned the Tostito stuff is because they followed the map. They followed where the future was. That's why they ended up with this product. Remember, those people were the same ones who did the Frito Bandito. Is anybody old enough to remember that? I'm a Frito Bandito. How well do you think that would work today in America? Okay, but it works very well for salsa, which they didn't start introducing until the mid-80s. So in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the people who came from a formative age before 1980 preferred ketchup. Because what did we grow up eating? Hamburgers, hot dogs, and French fries, right? Which are the 3 major things we use for ketchup. And then salsa came from all the things that came afterwards. And in fact, this map, which is a media map put out by, what was it? I'm trying to remember what it was, but I think it was one of the major online dailies, talked about how this product was so much different from the way other products were introduced. If you're Starbucks, you introduce a product in, it was actually Seattle, but that kind of idea of East Coast going inward, where there's kind of a proletarian adoption, as it's been referred to. But this is different. They went into the places where the people were, where there was high Latino immigration in the 70s and the 80s and today, and salsa then spread out eastward. Very different. So what does that have to do with fundraising? I think it has everything to do with fundraising. That companies like General Mills, for example, decide, you know what, everybody has to eat, we have to sell food. But the question isn't who we think we are based upon our past experience, but who is it that we want to be based upon what the future is. And so when they put a picture on their website, they put this wonderful picture of all these people who I find fascinating also because there's no specific kind of ethnic thing that we can label on these people. We're not going to put a little pin on them and say Asian, African American, Latino. It's the American family sitting here, but it's a particularly diverse American family eating a diverse group of foods. It's a decision they're making, which I think goes to the heart of here's your brand identity, and we're holding it up to you. Another way of thinking about that is the way that they've handled their image over time. And I don't know if any of you have seen this before. Anybody seen this previously? It's fascinating because this is Betty Crocker, right? Everybody in this room who grew up in the United States has had something from Betty Crocker. Your mother made something, your father made something, maybe you made something. That was Betty's image back in the 30s, and that is her image today, which is a composite they developed in 1996, which is multiracial, multi-ethnic, consisting of 75 women, and particularly women of color. But she's not a woman who fits in a box. She's a woman who people can respond to when they look at her image. And that's the whole point. Which is what I'm going to talk about here, which is the mirror we hold up. When we think about a mirror, think about the mirror that you look at every day when you get up in the morning, unless you're like me and you don't want to look at that thing, that image. But if you actually look at yourself, what's the first thing you see in that mirror?
Your eyes.
Your eyes, actually, it's very specific. I think that's true. You're looking at your face, right? Your eyes, your face, whatever part of your body you're looking at. But you're looking at you. You're looking at yourself. Now, if you're standing next to someone else, maybe then you notice them. And then you pull back a bit and you see the things around you. And that's the world around that. But you're looking at yourself in the context of your world as you see it going backwards. And what I'm wondering is if what General Mills has done is essentially said, you know what, we're going to flip that mirror around and aim it at the customer and let the customer see themselves. And I think that's a pretty fascinating idea. And I think it's particularly relevant right now, too, because the changes that have happened demographically to the United States are so profound. We've gotten right here in Montgomery County in Virginia, particularly marked changes. So how many of you are from this area? Okay, so a few. I moved to Virginia a few years ago, primarily because there was so much change in the area. It was appealing to my family. And in our case, we found that our school system, Fairfax County Schools, have over 100 languages spoken in the school system. Now, this isn't a decision they made by curriculum. It's a decision that was made because people decided to move there in clusters and started informing what these neighborhoods were about and who they were. So we've had a massive change here in just the last decade. What does that mean in real terms? It means that the services that are provided are markedly different than they would be if the audience were like it was 40 years ago when the schools were massively segregated. This kind of change is happening on a national basis where we know, most of us know the anecdote, that by 2050, America will be a minority-majority country, especially because of Latino immigration population change. And there's one other major factor here, which I think is particularly important and relevant to us in fundraising, and that is that as that change occurs, there's another massive undercurrent, and that is birth rates. The birth rates among Latino and Hispanic families are much higher, especially newly arrived families, than among the traditional white core population from which we fundraise. We're talking about a birth-to-death ratio in the Latino community of 9-to-1 versus in the white community, baby boomers, our traditional fundraising market, of 1-to-1. Think about that. So we can talk about a lot of things from a political angle or a social angle, but when it comes right down to the numbers, there are going to be a lot more people coming from that community very rapidly. I'm a recovering fundraiser, which means that for the past 25 years, I found where money is. But the whole trick to money is similar in some respects, I think, I'm sure you'll tell me if I'm wrong, to what we have to do when we're trying to get people interested in a campaign or in a candidate. And that is, it's not just about their message, it's not just about the policies, it's not just about how that candidate delivers that content, it's about actually what you're doing. And I don't just mean the techniques and the logistics of what you do, and although the presentations I saw were brilliant in that regard, but rather that you're going and you're asking people to support this person. You're doing it 1-to-1. And of course, all of your volunteers are doing so. And that's exactly what happens in fundraising. How many of you have been involved in fundraising for a nonprofit at some point? Okay, so a few of you. A charitable organization. There's laughter, which kind of alarms me.
Nonprofit organization.
Yes. Well, that's true, but that's different. Charitable 501c3s. The reason I ask is because I think that set of experiences is kind of analogous to what we do. But I think that fundraising is being challenged in the way that politics is being challenged with social media. In that the data that you have that we just saw represented on the screen, you don't have any of that with a lot of people out there who suddenly awakened to politics just 2 years ago. You know this, but there are a lot of people, in fact, like me, who were in that group. I voted Democratic my whole life, even though my father designed the Republican elephant in 1969.
You did a fine job.
So that's my formative political memory, was people going through buttons, which is retail politics, and designing symbols. And my father did teach me a whole bunch of valuable lessons, and one of them was about keeping it simple, the messaging. All of that applies to social media. So what I'm going to do is try to condense an hour into 30 minutes, which is hard. Do it really fast, hopefully do it upbeat, because you want to get to the bar. But also because I think fundamentally social media provides us an opportunity we have never had for nonprofits, for fundraising for politics, and for candidates who are running in this new area. And that is that we have the ability to talk to people we have never talked to before. And one thing I know from fundraising, which I think is, again, analogous to politics, is we tend to work in the circles that we know, the addresses we have, the connections that we've made. And meanwhile, there's usually a population, it's usually 20 to 30%, who, despite our best efforts, we are not talking to them. And so they underperform for us. And so we're going to look at those people right now. Social networking before and after. This is my own story. 20 years ago or so, we formed a group like this. Yeah, you won't be eating this at the bar. Where a bunch of us got together to form something called the Sushi Club. The idea was get together and talk sushi, talk about things that involve politics and trade. That little group of 6 people formed a group of 150 in the space of 12 months. Getting together at a restaurant once a month and talking politics because everybody wanted to be off the record. The limitations of that are the same limitations we have with any list you have, which is that it's only the people we've actually managed to see or who actually we managed to invite. Today, of course, it's anybody who happens to be in the web and finds us. So the universe is dramatically expanded. Fundraising is the same kind of problem. Before we stood somewhere and asked for money, and later, just in the last 2 years, only the last 2 years, what happens when White Left John gets on after he gets on CNN and says there's a problem in Haiti?
all these people are empowered to reach out to their friends and raise money on behalf of that cause, Haiti. That's what drove text fundraising from $500,000 one year, where people said you can't really do it in this country, it doesn't work, even though it worked in the UK, to $37 million for the Red Cross alone in the space of 1 year. It wasn't about the technology, it wasn't about doing anything new on the fundraising side, it was entirely about people asking their friends to give, or asking them to support a mission. That's social media. And I think we're seeing the same thing to a lesser degree in politics, but we'll see it a lot more as we use the tools, as the people like yourselves go out there and mobilize them. That's that we used to put signs in yards, and we of course still need to do that. The same reason we need to write letters, we need to make phone calls, those things still work. But we've seen a major dramatic demographic shift. And that's that for people under the age of 45, generally don't like to talk on the phone. You see this because the cellular companies and the telephone companies have noticed that the kids, our kids, we have kids who are college age, those kids aren't using their phone minutes, but their text is going crazy. And in fact, I joke about this with Chrissy West, she isn't here, about how she doesn't like to take phone calls. This is a running joke with Chrissy. She only wants to text. This is really where we are. The real estate has changed. Real estate just as important as it's ever been, but now the real estate is not just in our front yard, it's on our Facebook page.
A lot of social media discussion over the last couple of years has all been about social good and social entrepreneurship and social everything, and that's great. It's good for us to all communicate and become friends and like one another and so forth. But if it's not about bringing in money, it's going to be very hard for you to find a few minutes and make it work for your organization because you need money for mission. So I'm all about that. And with that, I'm going to jump right in and get started. And I'm going to start with the bucket. From my vantage point, this is how I first saw philanthropy, probably like many of you did too, right? I mean, somebody asked you for a donation somewhere, and maybe it was the UNICEF box. Did everybody trick or treat for UNICEF?
Yeah.
Your kids? Okay, if you didn't, you actually cleared this orange box around, and when you wanted candy, you were actually asking people for money. It was a little tricky to navigate that, but you started getting a sense right away that if you asked somebody for something and they gave it to you, while you were getting something and that felt good, the person who was giving it to you felt even better. But there was a big problem with that transaction that we know in fundraising because we do it every day. And that is that it's transactional, and it's by invitation. I had to go to that person's house. In other words, my parents had to say, it's okay to go there. That they have good candy and that we know who they are. And so I went there and I asked for money. And then they might say, well, I gave you the money, but now you're done. You don't know, there's no record for UNICEF about how they got the money, where it came from. So they can't thank the person. It's geographically restricted. It's only my neighborhood. And there's a limit to the relationship. It's really about that day, Halloween, and now we're done. Until next year, if I'm still in that age group that's legally allowed to get candy. You've probably all heard about that. So anyway, this is very similar to what we experience in fundraising generally. We might have an event, or we might have a time of year, like Macy's, or with a bucket brigade. Or we might have people with booths out at the street corners raising money for the local fire department. And all of that's good, but it all has that limitation. Where I think we have a big opportunity here, in terms of raising money, not just raising awareness, and not just friend raising, but fundraising, is with what social media allows for us to do, if we're willing to take it to that level. And that is that it's an open tent, not in the political sense where we say every 2 to 4 years, yeah, we want everybody there. But in a real open tent sense, meaning we want everybody to be a part of the conversation and to actually go out and raise money on our behalf. It's empowering because we're giving people not just the tools to do that, but we're also giving them the authority to do it. There's really no geographic or other limitation. So with social media, you could have a person literally in a country where you cannot read the language advocating on your behalf to generate donations for you here locally. And there's no limit to the relationship, meaning that as long as you aren't putting a wall up saying, well, I'm only going to be here on Halloween, so I'll see you next year, that in fact they could continue advocating on your behalf in ways that you cannot control. And that's actually the risk and reward, which I think is both fascinating and frightening about social media, because it means we have to give up a certain measure of control to make it work. But I think that can be a lot of fun and very rewarding.